Martial arts and acting legend Chuck Norris has died. His family posting the news online earlier today. Norris redefined the role of the modern tough guy and action hero. There's a photograph you've never seen. It was taken in 2019 inside a ranch house in Navasota, Texas. And it shows a Bible sitting open on a handmade wooden table. The leather is cracked. The spine is broken in a way that tells you this book has been opened to the same page hundreds, maybe thousands of times. The edges of that page are darker than the rest, stained with the oil of a man's thumbs over what appears to be decades. And in the margins, in pencil, in a handwriting so small you'd need a magnifying glass to read it, there are 7 words. 7 words that were never meant to be seen by anyone. The man who wrote them is still alive. He is 84 years old. He has killed men in combat. He has trained with the most dangerous fighters on the planet. He has stood in front of cameras for 50 years and never once let the mask slip. But when someone finally read those 7 words out loud in a room full of people who thought they knew him, every single person went silent. And then one by one they broke. Not because of what the words said, because of what the words meant about everything he had been hiding. His name is Carlos Ray Norris. You know him as Chuck. And what was written in that Bible changes the way you understand the most misunderstood man in American culture. But I need to take you back, way back, because if you don't understand who this man actually is, stripped of every joke and every meme and every exaggeration the internet has plastered over him like wallpaper, you will miss the weight of what was on that page. And you cannot afford to miss it. Carlos Ray Norris is born on March 10, 1940 in Ryan, Oklahoma. Population at the time just over 1,000. His father, Ray Norris, is a mechanic, a truck driver, and an alcoholic so severe that he disappears for months at a time, sometimes years. His mother, Wilma, raises 3 boys essentially alone, in a house with no running water for stretches, in a town where poverty isn't a condition, it's the weather. Chuck doesn't talk about this. Not then, not for decades. What he does talk about later in interviews that almost nobody watches because they aren't funny and they don't fit the brand is the silence. He describes a childhood defined by the absence of a voice. His father's voice, his own voice. He is so shy as a boy that teachers flag him as potentially disabled. He doesn't speak in class. He doesn't raise his hand. He doesn't fight back when older kids target him. He describes himself in his own words as a skinny, non-athletic kid with no sense of self-worth. That's a direct quote. Write it down because it matters later. He joins the United States Air Force in 1958. He is 18 years old. He is stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, and it is there on a military base in a country still scarred by war that he begins training in Tang Sudo. Within 2 years, he earns his black belt. Within 5, he is competing at the highest levels of American karate. He wins the Professional Middleweight Karate Championship in 1968 and holds it for 6 consecutive years, retiring undefeated. Not mostly undefeated. Undefeated. He opens a chain of martial arts schools. He trains Steve McQueen, Bob Barker, Priscilla Presley, the Osmonds. He is the real thing, not an actor playing a fighter. A fighter who learned to act. And here is the part most people skip. Throughout all of this, from the Air Force to the championships to the movie career that follows, Chuck Norris does not drink. He does not smoke. He does not use drugs. He does not cheat on his first wife, Diane Holacek, until the marriage falls apart in 1988. And even then, the people closest to him describe a man destroyed by his own failure. Not defiant, destroyed. His publicist of 22 years, a woman named Linda Fuji, says something in a 2014 interview that almost no one picked up. She says, "Chuck is the most privately tormented man I have ever worked with. Not because of what happened to him, because of what he believes he did to others. Facts were his religion long before faith was. He measured everything. Calories, training hours, punch speed. He kept notebooks. He recorded everything. So when you understand that this is a man who documents, who tracks, who writes things down in margins with a mechanical pencil because ink smudges, you begin to understand why what was found in that Bible is not a casual scribble. It is a confession that took 40 years to write. Now go back and look at the photograph, the one from Navasota, and something is wrong. The Bible is open, yes, the page is worn, yes, but look at where it sits on the table. It is not on a nightstand. It is not on a bookshelf. It is on a woodworking table in an outbuilding on the Norris ranch, a building that Gina, his second wife, tells a visiting pastor is the place Chuck goes when he can't sleep. She says this casually as if it is a known fact of their household. Chuck can't sleep. He goes to the shop. He opens the Bible. He reads the same page. This has been happening for years. And the people closest to him, his wife, his children, his training partners, none of them have ever asked him about that page. Not because they don't care, because they're afraid. Not afraid of Chuck. Afraid of what the answer might be. Afraid of what it might reveal about a man they thought they had figured out. And here's what I need you to sit with before we go any further. The Bible is open to the book of Isaiah, chapter 53. If you know your scripture, your stomach just dropped. If you don't, stay with me, because the reason that page matters is not theological, it's personal and it's devastating. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what was written in the margin of that page is not a prayer. It's not a verse reference. It's not a note for a sermon or a Bible study. It is a sentence fragment in the handwriting of a man who has never publicly admitted what that sentence means. And it was read out loud by accident in front of 11 people. And none of them have been the same since. Isaiah 53 is known across virtually every Christian tradition as the suffering servant passage. It describes a man despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. It says he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Most theologians read this as a prophecy about Jesus Christ. Chuck Norris has read this chapter so many times that the page is nearly translucent. You can see the text from the other side bleeding through. And get this, the wear pattern on the page is not uniform. The bottom third is more worn than the top, which means he wasn't reading the whole chapter. He was reading over and over and over a single cluster of verses. Verses 4 to 6. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him. And with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Now here is where it starts to crack open. In the margin next to verse 6 in pencil, in that tiny handwriting, Chuck Norris had written 7 words. Those 7 words were read out loud by a man named James Leune. Leune is a pastor from Kingsport, Tennessee, who had been invited to the ranch in late 2019 for what was described to him as a small gathering of friends. Leune did not know Chuck personally. He had been invited by a mutual contact in the faith community. He arrives at the ranch expecting, in his own words, maybe a barbecue and some polite conversation about scripture. What he walks into is something else entirely. There are 11 people in the room. Gina Norris, 2 of Chuck's adult children, a former training partner named Bob Wall, who had fought alongside Chuck in tournament circuits in the late 60s, a military chaplain named Colonel David West, who had served with Chuck on a USO tour in the early 2000s, and 6 others whose names have not been made public, but who were described by Leune as people who clearly loved this man and were clearly worried about him. And get this, Chuck is not in the room when Leune arrives. He is in the outbuilding with the Bible. Gina walks Leune to the shop. She opens the door. Chuck is sitting at the woodworking table. The Bible open in front of him, his reading glasses on, a pencil in his right hand. He is not writing, he is just sitting there looking at the page. Leune describes the moment in a 2020 interview with a small Christian podcast out of Nashville. He says, "I've been in ministry for 30 years. I have sat with dying men. I have sat with men in prison. I have never walked into a room and felt the weight of silence the way I felt it in that shop." Chuck looks up. He doesn't say hello. He says, "Can you read something for me?" The soon walks over. Chuck slides the Bible toward him and points to the margin. Leune leans in and he reads the 7 words. But here's the part that doesn't let you sleep. Leune won't say the 7 words publicly. Not exactly, not verbatim. He has said in 2 separate interviews that the words were a question directed at God, written in a syntax that made it clear it had been revised multiple times. He says the eraser marks around the words were heavy. Chuck had written, erased, rewritten, erased, and rewritten this question over what appeared to be years, possibly decades. The pencil impressions were layered, and the question, without quoting it directly, concerned whether the suffering described in Isaiah 53, the bearing of grief, the caring of sorrow, the chastisement of the peace of others, applied to ordinary men, not to Christ, to fathers, to husbands, to men who had failed and spent their lives trying to carry the weight of that failure alone in silence without ever asking if the silence itself was the sin. Think about what that feels like. You are Chuck Norris. You are the man the entire world turned into a symbol of invincibility. You cannot be hurt. You cannot be broken. You cannot fail. That is the joke. That is the mean. That is the cultural identity the world has assigned to you. And every single night for years, you walk to a small building on your ranch and you open a Bible to a page about a man who was broken. And you ask God in pencil, in handwriting so small no one can read it without leaning in close enough to smell the leather. Whether your brokenness counts, whether it meant anything, whether carrying it alone was obedience or cowardice. Leon reads the words out loud. His voice catches. He looks at Chuck. Chuck doesn't move. He doesn't react. He just sits there the way he has sat there 1,000 nights before. And he waits. And then the Foon does something he says he has never done in 30 years of ministry. He closes the Bible, puts both hands flat on the table, and he weeps. Not a polite tear, he weeps. And Chuck Norris, the man who has spent 60 years mastering control over his body, over his voice, over every visible expression of vulnerability, reaches across the table and puts his hand on the pastor's arm and he says, "I know. That's all. I know." And get this, Gina is standing in the doorway. She has been watching. She later tells Colonel David West, who recounts this in a 2021 chapel service at Fort Bragg, that she had never seen her husband touch another man's arm like that. Not in comfort,